Welcome to Mr. Phantom, where fear hides in every shadow and chilling tales come to life. Before we start, make sure to subscribe and like this video to get a scary story every night. The night has grown late, and the world outside is quiet. The wind whispers softly through the cracks of the window, carrying a gentle calm. This is the time when thoughts drift, when old stories resurface from the dark corners of memory. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let yourself sink into tonight's tale. A story about a voice captured on an old cassette tape. The last voice before everything changed. Sit back, relax. Don't worry about anything. Just listen, and let this voice guide you into a world where secrets are buried in recordings, and where every whisper could be a sign of the end. Welcome to tonight's story, The Bloody Recording Tape. Moving to a new place had always been a mix of excitement and anxiety for me. The idea of fresh beginnings, new surroundings, and the possibility of meeting new people was something I had always welcomed. Yet there was also a lingering sense of unease that came with the unknown. My new house was nothing extraordinary. A simple two-story suburban home in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. It wasn't the biggest or the most modern house, but it had character, and it felt like a place where I could settle down and start a new chapter of my life. However, from the very first day, something about the house next door caught my attention. It was old, far older than the other houses on the block. The paint on the wooden panels was peeling. The windows were always covered with heavy curtains, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. Unlike the other houses, which had decorations or signs of life, this one looked abandoned. But it wasn't. I learned about the house's occupant from one of my new neighbors, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hill. She had been living in this neighborhood for over 40 years, and she seemed to know everything about everyone. When I asked her about the house next door, her expression darkened. "That's Victor's house," she said in a hushed voice, as if speaking his name too loudly might summon him. "He's been there for as long as I can remember. Never talks much, never lets anyone inside." "Is he dangerous?" I asked, glancing back at the house. Mrs. Hill hesitated before answering. "Not that I know of. But people say strange things happen around him. Best to keep your distance." Her warning did nothing to ease my curiosity. In fact, it only made me more intrigued. There was something unsettling about a man who lived alone in a house that looked like it had been forgotten by time. I decided that I would keep an eye on him, just in case. Over the next few weeks, I hardly ever saw him. Occasionally, I would catch a glimpse of a shadow moving behind the curtains, but that was it. He never left the house during the day, and at night, there was only a single dim light visible from one of the upstairs windows. The more I observed, the stranger it seemed. How did he get food? Did he ever go outside? One night, as I sat on my porch enjoying the cool evening air, I saw movement. The front door of the old house creaked open, and for the first time I saw him. Victor was an older man, perhaps in his late 60s, but there was something about him that made him seem even older. His posture was slightly hunched, and his thin frame was wrapped in an old brown coat despite the warm weather. His face was partially hidden beneath a shadowy fedora, and his hands, long and bony, clutched a small bag as he stepped onto the porch. He didn't look around. He simply walked to the sidewalk and disappeared into the night. I don't know what compelled me to follow him, but my feet moved before my mind could stop me. I stayed a good distance behind, careful not to make any noise. He walked slowly but with purpose, taking a path that led away from the neighborhood and toward the older part of town. The streets became emptier, the streetlights flickering as if struggling to stay alive. Then suddenly he stopped. I ducked behind a parked car, my heart hammering in my chest. He stood in front of an old pawn shop, its neon sign barely glowing. The shop looked like it hadn't had a customer in years, and yet, after a few moments, the door creaked open, and he stepped inside. I waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. 15. He never came out. Cautiously, I approached the shop. The door was locked, and the inside was dark. There was no sign that anyone had been inside for years. It was as if he had walked into thin air. I hurried back home, my mind racing with questions. Where had he gone? What was in that bag he carried? The more I thought about it, the more uneasy I became. Something was very wrong with this man. A few days later, something even stranger happened. I was unpacking some old boxes in the attic when I found it. A small, dusty cassette tape hidden beneath a pile of old newspapers. It was unlabeled except for one thing. My address was written on it in faded ink. My hands trembled as I held it. How did it get here? And more importantly, why? I didn't own a cassette player, but there was an old electronics store downtown that sold vintage items. The very next day, I bought a used player and rushed home to listen to the tape. I pressed play, expecting static or an old recording of music. Instead, what I heard made my blood run cold. A man's voice, soft at first, speaking in hushed tones. If anyone finds this, please, you have to believe me. There was a pause, followed by a sound, a distant creaking, as if a door was slowly being pushed open. Then the voice became frantic. He knows I'm here. Oh God, no, please. A sharp noise. A thud. Then silence. The recording ended abruptly, leaving only the sound of my own heavy breathing in the room. I played it again, and again. Each time, the voice became more terrifying. It sounded like a man pleading for his life, moments before something happened to him. And the worst part, the background noise, the faint, almost imperceptible hum in the recording. It was the same hum I heard coming from Victor's house every night. I turned off the cassette player, my hands clammy with sweat. My gut told me that I had just uncovered something I wasn't meant to hear. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound made me jump. Every shadow outside my window seemed to move. My mind kept replaying the last few seconds of the recording. The desperation in the man's voice. The final thud before everything went silent. Who was he? What had happened to him? And most terrifying of all, was I next? I couldn't stop thinking about the cassette. It was as if the voice on that recording had wormed its way into my brain, refusing to let go. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear it, desperate, pleading, cut off by that final, ominous thud. Whoever that man was, he had been in real danger. And judging by the way the tape ended, he hadn't survived. The biggest question was why my address was written on it. That single fact made my skin crawl. The cassette hadn't just been left behind by accident. It had been placed there. But by who? And for what reason? I spent the rest of the day pacing my house, my thoughts racing. Part of me wanted to forget I had ever found the tape, to pretend I had never listened to it. But I knew that was impossible. Some part of me already felt tangled in whatever mystery surrounded Victor's house. I needed answers. Despite my better judgment, I decided to take another look at the house next door. From my window, I could see that the curtains were still drawn, the place as silent as ever. If Victor was home, he wasn't making any noise. The entire property felt frozen in time, like something that had been abandoned decades ago. But I knew he lived there. I had seen him. As the sun began to set, I made my move. Keeping low, I crossed my yard and stepped into his overgrown front lawn. The grass was tall, unkempt, brushing against my jeans as I moved. The closer I got, the more unnatural the house felt. It wasn't just old, it had an air of something rotting, something forgotten yet watching. I reached the porch and carefully tried the doorknob. Locked. That wasn't a surprise. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something strange. A small wooden crate sitting just to the side of the front door, almost hidden by shadows. Curiosity got the best of me. I crouched down and lifted the lid. Inside were more cassette tapes, stacked neatly in rows. At least a dozen of them. Some had names written on the labels. Others had nothing at all. My stomach churned as I scanned the tapes, my fingers trembling as I picked one up at random. It had a name written on it, Daniel S. I didn't know a Daniel, but just seeing a name there made my breath hitch. My instincts screamed that I was looking at something I shouldn't be seeing. I was about to put the tape back when I heard something. The floorboards creaking inside the house. Victor was home. I froze. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Had he seen me? Had he heard me? The creaking continued, slow and deliberate. Footsteps. I grabbed the tape and bolted. My feet barely touched the ground as I ran back to my house, slamming the door shut behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I locked every door, every window, my mind spinning in terror. Had he seen me? Did he know I had taken one of his tapes? I stood there in the silence of my home, my back pressed against the door. Minutes passed, then an hour. Nothing happened. Maybe he hadn't noticed. Maybe I had gotten lucky. But deep down, I knew I wasn't safe. I didn't listen to the second tape right away. I couldn't. The first one had been disturbing enough, and something told me that what I had just stolen was going to be even worse. For the rest of the night, I sat on my couch, staring at the cassette player. The tape with Daniel S. written on it sat on the table in front of me, taunting me. It felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried the weight of something terrible inside. I told myself I wouldn't listen to it, that I should just get rid of it. But as the hours dragged on, I knew I couldn't ignore it. Finally, just before midnight, I gave in. With shaking hands, I placed the cassette into the player and pressed play. At first, there was only silence. Then a voice. "Is this thing on?" A man's voice. Nervous. Breathing heavy. I gripped the armrest of my couch. "Okay, if anyone finds this, my name is Daniel. Daniel Simmons. I don't know how much time I have." A rustling sound. He was moving, shifting. His breathing was fast, almost panicked. I went into his house. I know I shouldn't have, but I had to know. I had to see for myself. My entire body stiffened. Victor's house. Daniel had been inside Victor's house. The recording continued, his voice shaking. "He's not normal. I saw what he does. Oh God, he keeps them. A sharp thud, a gasp, a scuffle, then a new sound, a door creaking open. Daniel's breathing turned ragged. No, please. I won't tell anyone, I swear, just let me." Footsteps. Slow, heavy, approaching. Daniel whimpered. No, please." Then something horrifying. A deep voice, low and emotionless. "You shouldn't have come here, Daniel." I nearly dropped the recorder. It was Victor's voice. There was another scuffle, a loud thump, and then the tape cut off. I stared at the cassette player in horror. The room around me felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing against me. I had just listened to a man's final moments. And the worst part, Daniel's fate was sealed the moment he entered Victor's house. I barely slept that night. My mind kept replaying that last moment, the way Victor's voice had been so calm, so devoid of emotion. What had Daniel seen? What had he meant by "he keeps them"? And most terrifying of all, If every person who went inside that house disappeared, why had Victor invited me over earlier that day? I barely slept that night. Even when I closed my eyes, Daniel's voice echoed in my head, looping over and over again. You shouldn't have come here, Daniel. I could still hear Victor's calm, emotionless voice. The way he spoke so softly, yet with absolute finality. Daniel had died that night, and now I had his tape. By the time morning arrived, I felt like a wreck. My head pounded from the lack of sleep, and my body was tense, as if expecting something terrible to happen at any moment. The logical part of me told me to go to the police, to tell them everything, hand over the tapes, and let them deal with it. But what would I even say? Hey, my creepy neighbor might be a serial killer because I found some old cassette tapes in his yard. Yeah, that wouldn't go over well. Worse, there was no actual evidence of anything. Sure, the tapes were terrifying, but they didn't prove anything. They were just recordings. No bodies. No crime scene. No physical proof that something had even happened. For all I knew, the police would write me off as some paranoid idiot with an overactive imagination. And that thought made me feel completely alone. I spent most of the morning trying to distract myself, but no matter what I did, my mind kept drifting back to Victor's house. It was like the damn place had a pull on me, dragging me back into its mystery no matter how much I wanted to forget. By the afternoon, I was practically jumping at every sound. The creak of the floorboards, the wind rustling against my window, even the hum of the refrigerator made my skin crawl. I was paranoid, my nerves stretched so thin that I felt like I might snap at any second. And that's when I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. My blood turned to ice. The sound had come from my front door. I wasn't expecting anyone. For a long moment, I just stood there, my body frozen in place. The knocking came again, slow and deliberate. Whoever was outside knew I was home. They were waiting. I forced myself to move, creeping toward the peephole with my heart hammering against my ribs. And then I saw him. Victor. He was standing on my porch, hands tucked into the pockets of his long brown coat. His fedora was pulled low over his face, casting a shadow over his eyes. But even through the distortion of the peephole, I could see the faintest hint of a smile on his lips. I felt sick. He had never come to my house before. Not once. So why now? The thought sent a cold shiver down my spine. He knew. He had to know. Somehow, he had figured out that I had taken one of his tapes. But instead of breaking down my door, he had knocked. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay calm. "Oh yeah. Afternoon, Anthony," he said smoothly. His voice was deep, but disturbingly gentle, like someone trying to lull you into a false sense of security. "Mind if I come in?" Every cell in my body screamed no. I gripped the doorknob, willing myself to stay steady. I'm kinda busy right now, Mr. Victor." His smile widened ever so slightly. "That's a shame. I was hoping we could chat. You see, I noticed you outside my house yesterday evening." My stomach twisted into a knot. "Shit. Why, yeah," I stammered. I was just walking by. Thought I saw something on your porch." He tilted his head slightly. "Is that so?" His voice was unreadable. Not accusing. Not angry. Just studying me. I forced a nervous laugh. "Yeah. Anyway, I should get back to." "Actually," Victor interrupted, "I wanted to invite you over for dinner." My mouth went dry. Dinner. Inside his house. The exact same place where Daniel had recorded his final words. I struggled to keep my expression neutral. Thanks, but I've got some things to take care of." Victor nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "Of course, but I insist." It's been a long time since I've had company, and I'd really like to get to know my new neighbor better. The way he said it sent ice-cold fear straight through my veins. I hesitated. If I kept refusing, would he get suspicious? Would he start watching me even closer? Maybe if I played along, I could figure out what was really going on inside that house. I swallowed hard. "All right," I said, forcing a smile. "When?" His smile didn't falter. "Tonight, 7 o'clock. Everything inside me screamed that this was a terrible idea, but I nodded anyway. "All right, I'll see you then." Victor tipped his hat slightly before turning and walking back toward his house. I didn't move until he disappeared behind his front door. The second he was gone, I stumbled away from my own door, my entire body shaking. I was walking straight into the lion's den. The hours before dinner passed in a blur of anxiety. I couldn't focus on anything except the fact that I was about to step into Victor's house, into the same house where people had vanished. I needed a plan. If I was going inside, I had to be prepared. So I packed a few things: my phone, a small pocket knife, and a second phone that I kept hidden in my sock, set to record just in case. If something happened, at least I'd have evidence. By the time 6:50 rolled around, my nerves were completely shot. But I couldn't back out now. At exactly 7 o'clock, I stepped onto Victor's porch. I knocked. The door swung open almost instantly, as if he had been waiting for me. Victor stood there, still dressed in his long brown coat, his face unreadable. "Right on time," he said, stepping aside. "Come in." I forced a smile and stepped inside. The door closed behind me with a quiet click, and the first thing I noticed was how wrong the house felt. The air was heavy, thick with something unnatural. The walls were lined with old, faded wallpaper that peeled in places, revealing darkened wood underneath. A dim, yellowish light flickered from an old chandelier above, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch too far. And then I saw it. Against the far wall was an old wooden shelf, lined with dozens of cassette tapes, neatly labeled, names, one after another. And my heart nearly stopped when I saw the newest label. Anthony B. My name. Victor followed my gaze, his smile never faltering. "You must be hungry," he said softly. "Come, let's eat." I turned to face him, and in his hand was an old-fashioned cassette recorder, already recording. The small red light on the recorder blinked at me. A quiet but steady hum of tape rolling filled the heavy silence between us. Victor stood there, still smiling, still watching, his fingers resting gently on the recorder's buttons as if daring me to move. The air in the house felt thick, suffocating. The dim chandelier above cast flickering shadows, making everything seem alive in a way that felt profoundly wrong. The old wallpaper curled at the edges, and an unsettling dampness clung to the air, like a place that had been forgotten for too long. My name was on the shelf, Anthony B., written in the same neat, precise handwriting as the others. And now the recorder was rolling. I forced myself to swallow the lump in my throat, my body stiff as I slowly turned back toward Victor. I had to play this smart. If I panicked, I was done. Victor's smile widened as if reading my mind. "Come," he gestured toward the dining room. "Dinner is ready." I hesitated, but there was no way out. Not yet. If I ran now, I had no doubt in my mind that he'd stop me before I even reached the door. So I nodded, forced my feet to move, and stepped into the dining room. The dining table was set for two. A single candle flickered in the center, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. The plates were old, porcelain with intricate floral patterns that had long since faded. The silverware looked just as antique, polished to a perfect shine. And in the middle of the table sat a roast. It smelled rich, seasoned with something I couldn't quite place. But my stomach twisted violently at the thought of eating it. Victor moved with a slow, deliberate grace, pulling out a chair for me. "Please sit." I hesitated. His hand still rested lightly on the recorder, the red light blinking steadily. I couldn't tell if it was just recording audio or something more. I sat. Victor took his place across from me, unfolding a napkin with a soft rustle before resting it neatly on his lap. His smile never faltered. "You must be wondering," he said finally, "why I invited you here." I didn't answer. My fingers dug into my thighs beneath the table. He tilted his head slightly. "You've been curious, haven't you?" I forced out a nervous chuckle. "I mean, we are neighbors, just trying to be friendly." Victor's eyes flickered with something unreadable. That's what the others said, too. My entire body turned cold. I glanced toward the shelf in the other room, where the tapes sat, lined up in neat little rows. The others. How many people had sat in this exact chair before me? How many had smiled awkwardly at this man, trying to keep their composure while knowing something was terribly, terribly wrong? I reached for the fork in front of me, more to have something to hold on to than anything else. My fingers trembled slightly. Victor watched. "You're not eating," he noted, his voice smooth as ever. I forced a smile. Not really that hungry. A flicker of something passed behind his eyes. "Ah," he sighed, setting his silverware down with a soft clink. "That's a shame. I had hoped you would enjoy your last meal." The words sent a jolt of raw terror through my entire body. I barely had time to react before Victor moved. His hand shot forward, fast, grabbing the cassette recorder and slamming it down on the table between us. The force of it rattled the plates, the candle flickering wildly from the sudden movement. My pulse exploded in my ears. The tape continued rolling. Victor leaned in slightly, his gaze never leaving mine. "You shouldn't have taken that tape, Anthony." Every muscle in my body locked up. My lungs burned as I tried to steady my breathing to keep my face neutral. I don't know what you're talking about," I said, though the words felt hollow. Victor chuckled. It was a quiet, almost amused sound. He reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out the exact tape I had stolen. "Daniel S." I felt my stomach drop through the floor. "I always know when one goes missing," Victor murmured, rolling the cassette between his fingers. "And I always know who takes them." I tried to process the situation, tried to think of any possible way out of this. But my mind was blank, drowning under the weight of my own fear. Victor leaned forward. "Tell me, Anthony, what did you think of Daniel?" My throat was too dry to answer. He tilted his head. "Did you listen to the whole thing?" I nodded slowly. Victor smiled. "Then you understand what happens next." A sharp ringing filled my ears. No. I forced myself to stay calm, gripping the edge of the table so tightly that my knuckles went white. "Look, Victor, Mr. Victor, I don't want any trouble, okay? I was just curious. That's all. I didn't mean to." His smile didn't waver. "Curiosity," he mused. "Yes, that's what they all say, too." He placed the tape gently back onto the table, right beside the recorder. I barely resisted the urge to bolt from my chair. Victor sighed, tapping a long, pale finger against the wooden surface. "You know, Anthony, I find it fascinating. People like you always want to know. They peek through their windows, they listen at their doors. They step just a little too close to the abyss, thinking they can turn back whenever they want." His gaze darkened. "But the abyss always sees them, too." I swallowed hard. Victor sat back, exhaling as if savoring the moment. "I have to admit, I had a feeling about you from the start. You remind me of Daniel, actually. Same curiosity. Same foolishness." He reached for his silverware again, casually cutting into the roast. The sound of the knife scraping against the plate made my skin crawl. "But don't worry," he said, voice soft, almost comforting. "You won't have to wonder for much longer." I needed to get out. Now. But if I made a run for it, would he stop me? Would I even make it to the door? Victor was watching me carefully, as if anticipating my next move. The recorder kept rolling. I forced a deep breath. "Actually," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I think I left my stove on. I should." Victor's smile vanished. A sharp silence fell between us. I had never seen his expression blank before. It was terrifying. For the first time, I saw what was behind the smile. And then, in one slow, deliberate movement, he pressed stop on the recorder. The tape clicked into silence. Victor tilted his head slightly. "Run," he whispered. I didn't hesitate. I shoved my chair back, nearly knocking it over as I bolted toward the door. My legs screamed as I ran, my fingers already reaching for the knob. But before I could grab it, the lights cut out, and the last thing I heard before the darkness swallowed me whole was Victor laughing. The laughter slithered through the darkness like a whispering ghost. It was soft at first, almost teasing, but then it grew, low, guttural, hungry. I lunged for the door, my fingers scrabbling against the knob, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. From the inside, a sharp breath hitched in my throat. I twisted the knob frantically, yanking and pulling with every ounce of strength I had. Nothing. Behind me, the laughter stopped. The silence was worse. I could feel Victor watching me in the dark. I could hear his slow, deliberate breaths, the sound of something shifting against the wooden floor. "Think, Anthony. Think." My eyes darted around, trying to adjust to the pitch-black void. The dim glow from the streetlights outside barely seeped through the heavy curtains, casting long, twisting shadows across the walls. A shape moved. I bolted left, diving into what I hoped was the hallway. My shoulder slammed into the wall, pain jolting through my arm, but I forced myself to keep moving. Footsteps followed. Slow. Measured. He wasn't running. He was enjoying this. I sprinted blindly, my hands outstretched, feeling for anything that could lead me to a way out. My heart pounded so violently that it felt like it was trying to rip itself out of my chest. Then, a door. I fumbled for the handle, twisting, unlocked. I threw myself inside and slammed it shut, pressing my weight against it. My breath came in ragged, uneven gasps. Silence. I squeezed my eyes shut, willing my body to stop shaking, to stay quiet. Then, the softest tap against the wood. Tap, tap, tap. I bit down on my lip, so hard I tasted copper. Victor's voice was right outside. "Anthony," he whispered, almost sing-song. "You can't hide. You're part of it now." "Part of what?" I pressed my back harder against the door, scanning the room in the dim light. It was a study. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with more tapes, more names. A single desk stood in the center, papers scattered across it. And on the far side of the room, a window. My pulse surged with hope. I bolted toward it, shoving aside stacks of paper, not caring how much noise I made. My fingers fumbled at the latch, lifting it with shaking hands. It was painted shut. I let out a strangled curse. No. No, no, no. Behind me, the doorknob rattled. Victor sighed. "Don't make this difficult, Anthony." I scanned the desk frantically. There, a lamp. I grabbed it and hurled it at the window. The glass shattered with an ear-piercing crash. Cold night air rushed in. Victor kicked the door open. I jumped. For a split second, time slowed. The ground rushed toward me, the wind roaring in my ears. Then, impact. Pain exploded through my leg as I hit the ground. A sharp, burning sensation shot up my ankle. I bit back a scream. No time. Move. I forced myself up, limping toward the street. My house wasn't far. If I could just. Something grabbed my wrist. I whipped around, my breath catching in my throat. But it wasn't Victor. It was a woman. Wild, panicked eyes. Blood smeared across her face. Her hair hung in tangled, dirty strands. Her grip was vice-like, fingers digging into my skin. "Help me," she gasped, voice raw with terror. "Please." Then, from above, Victor laughed. I yanked away just as something heavy hit the ground where I had been standing. The woman screamed and bolted into the darkness. I turned. Victor had jumped. He stood up like nothing happened. His coat fluttered slightly as he dusted himself off, smiling that same calm smile. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. I sprinted toward my house, pain shooting through my ankle with every step. I reached my front porch, slamming into the door. My fingers fumbled with the keys. Come on, come on. I felt him behind me. The lock clicked open. I lunged inside, turning to slam the door shut. Victor stood right there. His face was inches from mine. A thin layer of glass separated us. He smiled. I was too afraid to breathe. Then, he lifted the recorder. The red light was still blinking, still recording. His fingers hovered over the rewind button. He pressed it. A soft, whirring sound filled the silence. And then, a voice crackled from the speaker. "Please, if anyone hears this, my name is Anthony B. I don't have much time." My own voice. From just seconds ago. Before it even happened. Victor tilted his head, watching me with utter amusement. Then very softly, he mouthed, "See you soon," and walked away. I slammed the door shut, locking it with everything I had. I stumbled backward, my chest rising and falling in panicked gasps. The recorder, the tapes, the names, my name. I was next. But somehow, the recording already knew. And I had no idea how to stop it. I sat on the floor of my living room, staring at the door as if Victor could somehow walk through it at any second. My whole body was shaking, my breath coming in short, uneven gasps. The recorder, the tape with my voice on it. I tried to tell myself it was a trick, that maybe Victor had somehow recorded me in real time and played it back, but deep down, I knew the truth. The recording was made before it happened. My voice, my exact words. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to think. My hands curled into fists on the carpet as my mind raced through everything that had happened. Victor knew I would be next. The tape knew I would be next. But how? I needed to find a way to break this. To stop it. I pushed myself up, my ankle screaming in protest. I winced, limping toward the window, peering outside. The street was empty. No sign of Victor. No sign of the woman I'd seen earlier, the one who had grabbed my wrist and begged for help. I should have helped her, but I had been too terrified to do anything. I clenched my jaw, gripping the windowsill so hard my fingers turned white. I wasn't going to sit here and wait to die. If the tape could predict my future, then I would change it. I spent the next hour trying to figure out what to do. First, I locked every door, every window. I checked my phone, but my hands were shaking too badly to type properly. I tried calling the police, no answer. That's when the first strange thing happened. The lights flickered. Just once. A quick flash. I froze, phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the endless ringing on the other end. The room went dark. My stomach dropped. The power was out. I lowered my phone slowly, my pulse thundering in my ears. My breath felt loud, too loud. The entire house was silent. Then, a click. A single, mechanical click from the other side of the room. I turned my head slowly. The recorder sat on my coffee table, its red light blinking. Recording. I hadn't touched it. My blood turned to ice. Then the static started. Soft at first, like a distant whisper. It crackled and hissed, a sound so faint it barely registered at the edge of my hearing. But then, a voice. "Help me, please. Someone." I knew that voice. My own voice. But it wasn't from earlier. It was from the future. I could hear myself panicking, my breath uneven, my words slurred with terror. "He's coming. Oh God, he's coming." I stumbled backward, my body slamming into the couch. "If anyone finds this, don't." A horrible, wet sound cut me off. Then, silence. I couldn't breathe. I stared at the recorder as the red light blinked. Still recording. Still playing my future. My mouth was dry. My fingers dug into the fabric of my jeans. I reached for it slowly, my hands trembling as I pressed the stop button. The red light flickered off. Silence. I exhaled shakily, forcing air into my lungs. This was wrong. I needed to destroy it. I grabbed the recorder and hurled it at the ground. The plastic casing cracked, the battery popped out, but it was still intact, still watching me. A shiver ran down my spine. And then, in the absolute silence of the house, the phone rang. I nearly jumped out of my skin. I turned, staring at it from across the room. No caller ID. A lump formed in my throat. I didn't want to answer it, but something in my gut told me I had to. Hand shaking, I picked it up and pressed it to my ear. "Hello." At first, silence. Then, a whisper. "Anthony." My whole body locked up. I recognized the voice immediately. Victor. I nearly dropped the phone, but I forced myself to stay calm. My grip tightened. "What do you want?" I whispered. A soft chuckle. "I told you, Anthony. You're part of it now." I swallowed hard. Part of what? Silence. Then, so quiet I almost didn't hear it. "Check your porch." The line went dead. I threw the phone away like it was poison, my breath ragged. I turned to the door, my stomach twisting into knots. I didn't want to check, but I had to. Slowly, I walked toward the front door. Each step felt like walking through wet cement, my body screaming at me to turn back. I reached for the handle, twisted it, and pulled the door open just a crack. The street was still empty. But there on the porch, a tape, another cassette tape, sitting right on my welcome mat. My fingers clenched the doorframe. I shouldn't pick it up. I should throw it away, burn it, anything but. I bent down, hesitated for just a second, then grabbed it. The label was handwritten in red ink. It said my name. My hands trembled as I turned it over, my mind screaming at me to just stop. But I couldn't. I pushed the door shut, locking it behind me, and took the tape to my old cassette player. I didn't want to play it. But if I didn't, I'd never know what was coming. My throat was dry as I slid the tape inside. My fingers hesitated over the play button. Then, I pressed it. Static. Then my voice. I made a mistake. My stomach dropped. I shouldn't have played this. If you're hearing it, it's already too late. My breath hitched. He's here. Then, a loud bang. Not from the tape. From inside my house. The bang echoed through the house like a gunshot. I froze, my hand still hovering over the cassette player. My body refused to move, my brain trying to process if the sound had come from inside or outside. Then, another bang. This time closer. My breath hitched in my throat. The tape was still playing, my own voice whispering through the speakers. He's here. I snapped the player off, plunging the room into heavy silence. Then I heard it, the softest creak of a floorboard, somewhere in the darkness behind me. I turned so slowly, my neck stiff with terror. The house was silent, too silent. The lights were still out, the only illumination coming from the streetlights outside. They cast long, eerie shadows through the windows, stretching and bending like twisted fingers along the walls. I held my breath. Nothing moved, but I knew I wasn't alone. I reached for my phone, only to remember I had thrown it across the room earlier. It was lying on the carpet, screen down, near the coffee table. Too far. If I ran for it, I'd make noise. I clenched my jaw, trying to think. My fingers curled into fists. If I'm quiet enough, maybe I can make it to the door. Maybe. Then a whisper. So soft, I almost thought I imagined it. Anthony. Every hair on my body stood up. It was right behind me. I bolted. Pain shot through my ankle as I pushed forward, but I ignored it. I lunged for the front door, my fingers grasping at the lock. I twisted it open just as something grabbed my shirt. I let out a strangled yell, yanking away. Fabric ripped, but I didn't care. I threw myself out onto the porch, stumbling onto the cold concrete. My heart pounded as I scrambled back, my hands slamming onto the ground as I looked up. The house was empty. No one was there. But my front door, it was wide open. I panted, my breath coming out in short, ragged gasps. My ankle throbbed, but I barely felt it. My eyes stayed locked on the doorway, waiting, expecting something to step out. But nothing did. The house stared back at me, dark and still. I pushed myself up, hands shaking as I backed away onto the street. I needed to leave. Go to a motel. Get out of town. Anything. Then, my phone rang. I jumped so hard I almost fell again. I had no idea where the sound was coming from. My phone was still inside the house, lying somewhere in the darkness. But it was ringing. The same no-caller ID. I didn't move. I just listened. The phone rang once. Twice. Then it stopped. A second later. A notification sound. A voicemail. I licked my lips, my throat dry. I wanted to ignore it. Every inch of my body screamed at me to just run. But my fingers moved on their own. I pulled out my work phone, the spare one I kept in my car, and dialed my voicemail. A robotic voice spoke first. You have one new message. First unheard message. A click. Then static. Soft, crackling static. And then Victor's voice. You can't run, Anthony. A chill rushed through me. It's already written. I felt like I was going to be sick. Go ahead. Check the next tape. The voicemail ended. I stood there, gripping the phone so tight my knuckles turned white. Victor was playing with me. And worst of all, he was right. I knew what I had to do. I had to go back inside. I moved slowly, every muscle tense, every breath shallow. My own house felt like a stranger's home, foreign and wrong. The air felt heavier inside, thick with something unseen. The cassette player still sat on the table. The new tape, the one with my name scrawled across it, lay beside it. I reached for it, my fingers trembling. I slid it into the player. Pressed play. The tape whirred for a moment. Then, my own voice crackled through the speakers. This is Anthony. If you're hearing this, I don't have much time. I swallowed hard. Victor is coming. I tried to stop it, but he always knows. He's always one step ahead. I clenched my fists. But I finally understand now. The tapes don't just predict the future. A long pause. They create it. My breath hitched. Victor doesn't just record voices. He records fate. And once your voice is on one of these tapes, it's over. A lump formed in my throat. I don't know if I can change it, but if anyone hears this, please. A loud thud cut my voice off. Then, a new voice. Victor. That's enough, Anthony. The tape stopped. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, from the hallway, a floorboard creaked. I wasn't alone. I didn't think, I just ran. I grabbed the tape and sprinted toward the back door. My legs screamed in protest, my ankle threatening to give out, but I forced myself to keep moving. Another creak. Closer. Victor was inside the house. I shoved the back door open and burst into the night air, sucking in a desperate breath. My feet hit the pavement as I ran for my car, fumbling for my keys. I reached the driver's side, yanked the door open, and threw myself in. My hands shook violently as I shoved the key into the ignition. The engine coughed. Didn't start. I twisted the key again, harder. Come on, come on, come on. The engine roared to life. I threw the car into reverse, my tires screeching against the pavement as I sped backward. My headlights lit up my house, and for a split second I saw him, Victor, standing in the doorway. His face was calm, his hands tucked into his pockets, and he was smiling. I gunned the engine and tore down the street, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The city lights blurred as I sped away, my thoughts racing. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew one thing. I had to destroy this tape, before it destroyed me. I drove like my life depended on it, because it did. The city lights blurred past me, but I barely noticed them. My heart pounded so hard it drowned out the roar of the engine. The cassette tape, my tape, sat on the passenger seat, a small, unassuming thing. But I knew better. This wasn't just a recording. It was a death sentence. Victor had said it himself. Once your voice is on one of these tapes, it's over. I gritted my teeth, hands clenched around the steering wheel. Not if I destroy it first. I didn't know where I was going at first, only that I had to get far away. But then an idea hit me. The bridge. It was about 15 minutes from here, stretching over the river that cut through the city. If I tossed the tape into the water, it'd be gone for good. No player, no recording, no fate. That was the plan, and it was a good plan, until my car radio crackled to life. At first, it was just static, a low, hissing noise that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Then, a voice. Anthony. I swerved, barely keeping the car on the road. Victor. His voice was too clear, too close. Like he was sitting in the back seat, whispering in my ear. You can't run from this. My breath hitched. You think breaking the tape will save you? He chuckled, and I swore I heard something shift in the back seat. Go ahead. Try. I reached for the power button, trying to shut off the radio, but it wouldn't turn off. See, Anthony, the tape isn't just a recording. It's a part of you now. Something moved in my rearview mirror. I didn't look. I couldn't. I slammed my foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, speeding through the empty streets. I could see the bridge now, the dark stretch of road leading over the river. Almost there. You're making a mistake, Victor's voice warned. I didn't listen. I hit the bridge going 80, my hands locked on the wheel. My pulse roared in my ears. Just a little further. Then, the car died. The engine cut out completely, leaving me coasting in dead silence. My headlights flickered. Then the radio crackled again. I warned you. The car slammed to a stop, like something had grabbed it. My body lurched forward, the seatbelt cutting into my chest. I gasped for breath, fingers scrambling at the keys, trying to restart the car. But it was no use. It was dead. The tape sat untouched on the passenger seat, looking almost innocent, like it hadn't just been whispering threats through my speakers. I stared at it, my chest heaving. Then slowly I reached out. I grabbed the tape, fingers tightening around the plastic case. It felt too warm, like it had been sitting in the sun. I shoved the door open and stumbled out into the cold night air. The bridge stretched before me, empty and silent. The water below was black, shifting in slow, endless waves. I walked to the edge, tape clutched in my hand. "You don't want to do that." I spun around. Victor stood behind me. Not a recording, not a voice over the radio. Victor, in the flesh. He looked exactly the same as when I first met him. Same polite smile, same calm demeanor. Like we were just two neighbors chatting over the fence. Except we weren't, and I wasn't buying the act. I stepped back, gripping the tape like a weapon. "Stay the hell away from me." He sighed, shaking his head. "I liked you, Anthony. I really did." I didn't answer. I just turned back toward the river. But before I could throw the tape, his voice changed. "You don't think I planned for this?" I hesitated. "Go ahead. Toss it in. See what happens." My grip tightened. I could feel the plastic casing bending under my fingers. Then, I heard it. A soft click. My blood ran cold. I knew that sound. It was the same sound a tape made when it started recording. I turned my head just enough to see. In Victor's hand, there was another recorder. A red light blinked on its surface. And it was recording. "You really don't get it, do you?" Victor murmured. He pressed stop, then held up the recorder, and pressed play. A familiar voice crackled out. My voice. I didn't listen. I hit the bridge going 80, my hands locked on the wheel. My pulse roared in my ears. Just a little further. My own words. From minutes ago. My stomach dropped. "You think you're in control?" Victor said softly. I turned fully to face him now, heart slamming against my ribs. "You were on the tape before you ever even pressed play." A deep dread settled in my chest. Victor smiled. And now, he lifted the recorder again and pressed record. Anthony takes one step back. Before I could even think, my foot moved. I stumbled backward, my heel landing right on the edge of the bridge. My arms flailed, trying to regain balance. Anthony panics. My breath caught. I was panicking. Anthony falls. My stomach dropped. The world tilted. The last thing I saw was Victor watching me, calm, content, as my body tipped over the edge. Then, darkness. I woke up to silence. No Victor. No tapes. Just the endless sound of water dripping. I was somewhere cold. The air felt damp, the darkness around me thick and absolute. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy. Something was in my hand. I looked down. It was a tape. Not the one I had before. This one had new writing on it. A single word. Victor. I stared at it, my breath coming in shallow gasps. Then, in the darkness, I heard a soft click, and Victor's voice whispered through the void. "Welcome to the recording, Anthony."